Thanks, Mr Rudd. If I can go back to the first point about national institutions and the current controversies, we seem to have reached a bit of a stalemate on the question of what happens to Christian Porter and the role of Attorney General. If we can take a step back from what you say is the Prime Minister's political management, what should be the test and what should be the framework in which this issue, which is unresolvable for everybody involved in a criminal law sense, but what should be the test in a political sense and in terms of buttressing the political and national institutions like Parliament and like belief in government?
The accusations against Christian Porter are serious, among the most serious that can be made. Therefore, they cannot be treated as any trivial matter. I'm in no position to judge, nor is anybody else in this room, Porter's innocence or guilt. That evidence is not available to us. So the question arises, what then is to be done? So what are the options? One, recourse, as it were, to the normal processes of the criminal law. Well, as we know, that's now exhausted. The police have indicated they cannot proceed with this investigation, not least because the principal witness is now deceased and by report at her own hand, tragically. The second option, which has been canvassed, is that of a coronial inquiry. We need to reflect carefully on the limitations that would arise from a coronial inquiry should that unfold. A coronial inquiry may, for example, investigate the question of the deceased's state of mind, those factors impinging on that state of mind, whether or not there are sufficient support services surrounding that person at that time. But they would deal with the fact of her state of mind as opposed to the question of whether the underpinning facts had any substantiation or not. So that leaves us with a third possibility, which is that of an independent judicial inquiry, short in duration, quite focused in its terms of reference. I think the appropriate course of action under these circumstances is for that to occur, not least because what we are dealing with Commonwealth Government Cabinet Ministers, and not least the First Law Officer of the Commonwealth, are a set of standards which are way above those which are simply determined by the criminal code. We are dealing with positions of state in this country which are of the highest significance and therefore require people of unimpeachable integrity. Therefore, the virtue of a judicial inquiry, limited in time, of defined terms of reference, is it gives an opportunity for Mr Porter to answer for himself and for any others who have material evidence surrounding the accusations that have been made to also provide evidence, and for such a person making the inquiry to draw their own conclusions independently. On the final point associated with that, the question will then arise as to whether Mr Porter should remain as Attorney General during the prosecution of or the execution of such a judicial inquiry. I think if I was Mr Porter in these circumstances, it would be wise to voluntarily step aside while that occurred. As to whether he should be compelled to do so is a separate matter. I'm very mindful of the fact that when accusations were made against Mr Shorten, who was Leader of the Opposition, he did not stand aside from that position. But then again, that investigation was undertaken by the police, and of course the person making the allegation was still alive. And it was tested along those lines. So I don't wish to be hypocritical. I don't wish to have double standards here and say that it was fine for Shorten to remain in position, but it's not fine for Porter to do so. But if I were Christian Porter, this would probably be the best opportunity to clear your name through such a judicial inquiry at arm's length, short duration, defined terms of reference.
The next question is from David Crowe.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Mr Rudd. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. 25-year veteran of journalism, 20 years at Fairfax, 5 years at News Corporation. So I'm going to ask you about the past and the future in relation to the...
I remember you at News.
Every time you speak about this issue, I think back to that period in early 2010 when I was working at the Financial Review, and I think, you know, you got a fair hearing from the media, by and large, at that time. And I remember waking up and seeing the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald reporting on your retreat on climate change and thinking that can't possibly be right. Obviously it was. There was a failure of nerve within Labor on your leadership within, you know, months of that move. And I can't help but ask, in your criticism of the Murdoch media and the media generally sometimes, is there an element of scapegoating there because Labor failed in 2010 on your leadership because I think it had a failure of nerve? On climate change, on your leadership in general. And that leads me to another aspect of the same question, which is, in the future, do you think, given your thesis about the media, it's possible for Labor to win an election? If so, how does Labor win an election with the media landscape as you see it?
Wow, that's like giving a quick tour of the future of the Western novel. Let me start with the second first, if it's okay, David. My argument is not against Murdoch per se. My argument is always against monopoly. Monopoly is bad. None of you can look at me in the eye and say someone who has 70% of the print readership owned in their corporation does not represent a monopoly. It does, against any definition of monopoly available through Australian competition law. Of course, their counter case is, yes, but there are other media available. Well, the counterfactoid to that is one I've referred to in my speech today. Murdoch now has the biggest YouTube channel in the country. So whether it's traditional print or the content of print infiltrating its way into the electronics, because you know as well as I do, the radios, the televisions, every day they'll pick up what the newspapers are saying and it will frame a large part of the national conversation that day. And then you've got the direct intrusion into YouTube, which is why we have Sky After Dark, not just watched by that hardy band of 10,000 conspiracy theorists of an evening, as they all eat raw meat with each other, and drink. I won't say what they drink. And it now is being punched out through Australia's largest YouTube channel. So my argument, David, is about monopoly. The second point I'd say in response to your question is, I have not in my book, which was a little thicker than this, on my period as Prime Minister, blamed the Murdochs for my loss of the Prime Ministership. That's just not one of my accusations. They were certainly hypercritical, but no, this was an act by the factions of the Australian Labor Party, in large part because they didn't see me as ultimately controllable. And I think that is a matter of documentary record. And so my reflection actually in recent commentary on Murdoch has been what's evolved over the last 10 years. Prior to 2010, you know, Murdoch and his papers, 2/3 of the time, they'd basically back the Conservatives. 1/3 of the time, they would back the Labor Party, depending on where you were in the country. Since 2010, my friend, 19 out of 19. So I'm actually talking about a period in which, by and large, I haven't been in political office apart from my return in 2013. The trend line has become much more acute, much more intense, and therefore requires some of us to speak out. And the reason so few of us speak out, and David, you know this as well as I, is that people are afraid. If you challenge the Murdoch beast head-on in Australian public political life, they will come after you and take your head off because there is so much power and so much money at stake. Finally, in terms of the Labor Party's ability to prevail at the next election, I think I would say this. With the Murdoch media monopoly so intense, and very few of you in this room are from the People's Republic of Queensland. I am, okay? When you have every paper in the state, with a very few local throwaway exceptions, or some regional exceptions owned by Murdoch, it's nearly 100%. Frankly, the ability for Labor to win federally in Queensland is really difficult because it so much affects the local discourse in Queensland about federal politics. It really does. And so as a consequence, it makes it really hard to get there. Not impossible, just hard. If I can take some heart, however, if you campaign effectively and well, like Anastasia Palaszczuk did in the most recent state election, you can punch through. But by God, it's a fight every inch of the way because the media odds are stacked against you day after day after day.
The next question is from Greg Brown, who is from the News Limited Empire, otherwise known as The Australian.
Hey, where are the colleagues? There's usually a bunch of them.
Hello, Mr. Rudd.
Where are the colleagues? There's usually a bunch of them.
It's just me today.
Good. Welcome.
So you said that your government was squeaky clean, as far as you know, on allegations.
I said what I said. Don't paraphrase me already. I said I cannot guarantee that was the case.
Yeah, as far as you know. Yeah, no, I'm not trying to verbal you or anything.
Well, your newspapers usually do, but go on.
But people are also concerned about the culture of Parliament House for it being an unkind workplace. And this is where you have a problem. Some of your colleagues...
I was waiting for this to come, surprisingly, from News Corp. But go on, yes.
Some of your colleagues were critical of the way you treated staff and the people around you when you were Prime Minister, and as well as...
I presume that's why so many of them came back to work for me when I came back as Prime Minister.
Well, quite a few of them quit too. And there was... You've been accused of a concerted undermining of our first female Prime Minister when she ran during the 2010 election campaign.
Did you write the question or did Boris?
I wrote the question. Did your behaviour as a leader, in retrospect, fall short of appropriate workplace standards?
I think if you were to interview each of the cabinet colleagues at the time about my leadership of the government, my leadership of the cabinet, my leadership of my own staff, including my own staff, and compare that against the leadership of previous Prime Ministers, I would come out reasonably okay. And you know, none of us are perfect in this business, and I certainly am not. But that is an entirely different matter as to how we deal with those questions in the past to, frankly, the issues which give rise to this debate today. Your news organisation now runs, frankly, a campaign in parallel to that of the Morrison government on the question of Christian Porter. Your news organisation says
in fairness, Mr. Rudd,
what must prevail is the rule.
What you've had to say about the
rule of law, and that anything other than that is something which fundamentally undermines the principles of the Magna Carta, Westminster, and Runnymede on the Thames. And at the same time, the Morrison government argues that in fact what we have instead is trial by media. Morrison government saying trial by media, Murdoch media saying rule of law. Now, that's the narrative you two have agreed between yourselves. That's what happens every day in the media, and your exercise today, frankly, is one to divert away from that. Every accusation made against me in my prime ministership is taken head-on in my own autobiography. It has 1,500 footnotes. I suggest you go to the footnotes, read them, and interview the individuals who have made those accusations in the past. I'm entirely relaxed about that record, particularly when measured against my predecessors, including Bob Hawke, including Paul Keating, including others, including Gough Whitlam, who have occupied the office of Prime Minister. But I really think you should reflect on your own monstrous double standards as a media organisation.
But Mr. Rudd, do you have regrets about the way you spoke to people and treated people? I mean, there were reports of
never
a
with the
female
Murdoch meeting. I've always thought to be direct and to the point.
There was reports of a female flight attendant crying because you spoke to her so poorly.
Well, can I say
do you regret...
that once again represents a particular quality in Murdoch reporting at the time. If you bother to read the autobiography that I've written, it actually goes through that particular accusation in detail. Have you read it?
I've read your first book, but not the second one.
Well, you're asking questions about my record in office. That book deals with my record in office. If you wish to challenge elements of it, you should have the professional standing and integrity as a working journalist, not simply as a Boris Whittaker operative or a Chris Daw operative, to read the primary material first, look at the footnotes and then say, this is accurate, that is inaccurate, this is accurate, that's inaccurate. But you're here in order to do a political job on me. That is what News Corporation does. You never go to the substance of the argument I'm making, which is, do you have a monopoly on print media in this country? Yes or no?
Mr. Rudd, Greg Brown doesn't, so I think we can just sort of try to not personalise it here.
Just on that point, the Queensland point
that's the issue at stake today, and what you folks never want to address, including in last week's Senate inquiry, was this question of monopoly. You will seek to divert the subject to anything that suits you rather than address the central question, which is your abuse of the Murdoch media monopoly power.
Just on that point, you mentioned the large ownership that Rupert Murdoch owns a lot of newspapers in Queensland, but since you and Wayne Swan worked with Wayne Goss, Queensland wins at a state level Labor wins at a state level in Queensland nearly every time. So isn't it that Labor's getting at the federal level the politics wrong, whereas at a state level it's been successful?
The question here is whether you think, sorry, not you, whether your media proprietors who are watching this broadcast think that having 100% of the print media ownership in Queensland is a monopoly or not, and whether that's sustainable in any democracy. That's the issue at stake, not whether those within the democracy manage to work within it and try to compete as effectively as they can. As I said, each of your key lines and themes are those I've encountered in every press conference around the country, because they're served up by central casting in Holt Street in Sydney, where the Murdoch beast has its pulsating heart.
We've given a bit of extra latitude to Greg Brown because there's been a lot of attacks on the Murdoch organisation, so I thought that was reasonable.
Yeah, sure.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review has the next question.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Hard act to follow, that one. So I'm going to ask about something...
No, Greg Brown enjoyed every minute of it. He'll get brownie points back in Holt Street.
I'm going to ask about something infinitely more simple, and that's relations with China. You touched upon in your book about the need for a national strategy. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that for us today, particularly now we're, I guess, 6 weeks effectively into the Biden administration. We've just had the Congress in China and things like that. I'd be interested in your assessment of where things are at the moment. And related to that, the white paper that your government produced was the one that put in the marker on the ground for 12 submarines. Just obviously a bit of interest around that at the moment. Just wondering if you still think that is the optimum amount of submarines that we need, particularly given the challenges that we're having with China.
Good. Well, thank you for the question. On the future of the geopolitical challenges facing Australia, including the China challenge, it's real, it's big, and whoever is occupying political office in Canberra, this is an enduring national challenge of a large order of magnitude, which is why I've argued in this little book it shouldn't be trivialised into some sort of low-rent McCarthyist debate like you see out of the pages of the news organisation whose name we will no longer mention. It's more complex than that. It really is more complex. You refer to the 2009 Defence White Paper. We got into all sorts of trouble for producing that white paper at the time. Malcolm Turnbull accused me of being an old Cold Warrior and returning to an ancient combative past. Our friends in Beijing did not like it at all because we explicitly stated in the white paper that China's new actions in the South China Sea warranted a public explanation from Beijing as to what China's long-term military and regional foreign policy strategy was. Now, the Chinese didn't like that at all. And the truth is that because we saw changes in China's strategic posture in the South China Sea at the time, we as a Cabinet Security Committee took a conclusion that we had to name it and then recommend a full structure for the ADF for the future. We recommended a doubling of the Australian submarine fleet, an increase of the Australian surface fleet by 1/3. I stand by each of those recommendations because it's an appropriate posture. Secondly, dovetailing another element of my book, that's why we need a new national population strategy for this country, affording this country's long-term national security needs with one of the longest coastlines in the world, the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world, with a population not much bigger than that of the Netherlands, is a hard ask. Yes, we have an alliance with the United States. Long may it prosper and continue. But when you have this rolling internal debate within America about which way they want to go long term, it behoves us to actually begin to take care much more fundamentally of our own indigenous long-term national security interests. It's one of the reasons why I advocated Big Australia. It's a bigger tax base to afford a bigger ADF to meet the defence demands of a very big continent, because it's very tough to do it otherwise. So yes, every line that is articulated there I would stand by. Appropriate then, even more so now.
Thank you.
The next question is from Pablo Vinales from SBS.
Mr. Rudd, Pablo Vinales, SBS World News. Can I ask you on climate change? Some progressives within Labor have taken comfort in Joe Biden's victory last year, believing that it's a sign that voters, particularly in regional areas, are ready for a transition to renewable energy. Do you think that this coming election is a time for Labor to be bolder, as you say, to show courage? And if so, on climate change I should say, and if so, does that at the very least require a medium-term target going into the next election?
Yeah, one of the reasons I've written this little book is that climate change action takes courage. The previous intervention from, sorry, what's your name again?
Pablo.
No, Mr. Brown, is it? First name?
Greg Brown.
Greg Brown. Referred to our decision in 2009 not to cancel the carbon pollution reduction scheme, as you inferred. It was David's, my apologies, David said. Not to cancel the carbon pollution reduction scheme, but to defer it by 2 years. That's what we did. And David was right that the internal pressures at the time, driven by the national political and media debate, were intense. We're also facing challenges in terms of what would happen in terms of global action at the time. And that was the days of the Copenhagen conference. We're now 10 years on. So therefore, I would encourage the government, first and foremost, to adopt now a policy of mid-century 2050 carbon neutrality. Every other significant economy in the world, in the advanced economies, has done that. The United States has done that. The People's Republic of China have now moved to 2060. Japan has done 2050. Korea has done 2050. The European Union has done 2050. Are we going to be dragged kicking and screaming into this? If we don't do it, we're also going to face very soon border adjustment taxes from the European Union against Australia for being climate change laggards imposed on our exports. The second thing we need to do is bring about a new nationally determined commitment for the 2030s, which has a carbon peaking date, which is well in advance of where it currently is. Now, the debate among technicians is somewhere between 2025 and 2030, but there's a piece of mathematics here. If you go for a mid-century carbon neutrality target of 2050, frankly, you've got to have a credible trajectory from where you peak at carbon in the 2020s in order to get to that by 2050. And all that is necessary to keep temperature increases globally within 1.5 degrees centigrade. It's all mathematics at the end of the day, because science doesn't lie. So, in Australia, we need national courage to do both those things. The Liberal Party, who are currently the government of this country, need that courage. The global spotlight will be on them when we get to the Glasgow Conference of the Parties this November. And the spotlight will be on all political parties to get behind the government doing that.
We've got a few more questions. You're happy to go over time?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, the next question is from Tom Lowry from the ABC.
Thanks, Mr. Rudd. Can I ask you to reflect briefly on Australia's response to the situation in Myanmar? The federal government only confirmed over the weekend it was formally sort of cutting military ties with Myanmar. Should Australia have acted sooner, and what could the country do to actually create change and help return democracy to Myanmar?
This is a phenomenally complex subject. Through my work in the Asia Society, we work with the National League for Democracy, the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, and other political players in Myanmar/Burma. And the military have acted against Aung San Suu Kyi through the coup because frankly they feared losing power altogether and their hold on economic power and financial gain, which they have through their control of various monopoly companies within the country. So they're the underlying dynamics we actually need to understand. That's the reality that we're dealing with. So what can leverage the system back towards something which is more of a democratic future for Myanmar? The truth is, the essence of the debate now lies on this. Will the maximisation of civil protest movement across Myanmar, not just in Yangon and Mandalay and in Naypyidaw, but elsewhere in the country, open up cracks within the Burmese military? Now that is the actual debate that's underway in Myanmar at the moment. And so there is a game of nerves of steel at the moment between the military and the leaders of the protest movement on that essential question. What can the rest of us do, given that that's the essential internal reality? The rest of us need to maximise our support at a political and diplomatic level, which makes it plain that we in no way are legitimising the new military regime in Yangon, in Naypyidaw. That's why I think the Foreign Minister's statement about the cessation of assistance regimes to the Burmese military is correct. Should have been done earlier. Look, to be fair to Foreign Minister Payne, these are difficult and complex questions on the ground. I assume they've tried to use whatever contacts we have with the Burmese military to put messages through about a return to democracy. I don't discount the importance of that, but I do think it's important where they have finally moved. So I make no criticism of them.
Annabel Hennessy from the West Australian.
Hi, Mr. Rudd. Annabel Hennessy from the West Australian. Thank you for your address today. You've recently criticised media treatment of Julia Gillard from when she was PM. As we all know, Miss Gillard had criticised you in the ABC's Killing season. She described a bullying encounter in 2007 where she said you acted in a menacing and angry way after a 2007 tactics meeting. Given the discussion we're having now about the treatment of women in politics and also with the benefit of time, do you have any regrets regarding your relationship with Miss Gillard from when you were both MPs?
This was a highly combative political relationship between Julia Gillard and myself. The incident that you referred to, if you've read the volume 2 of my own autobiography, I explicitly address, I reject. There is no evidence to substantiate it whatsoever. If it were repeated today, it would trigger me to take defamation action.
Okay.
We're unsure.
Yeah. Matt Johnson from
The
Year
reason
11.
I didn't take it then is I wasn't made aware of it within the statutory period.
Matt Johnson from Year 11 at Canberra Grammar School has a question.
Hi, my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a Year 11 student in Canberra Grammar School. Before I start, my table back there, and I'm sure everyone else who is watching, I would like to thank you for the frankly riveting game of handball that you played with our principal last year. And my question is as follows.
He was not very good.
You crushed it.
You guys were good, but, you know.
Recently...
We do handball training camps. We just need to raise money for the National Apology Foundation.
Recently, particularly in the US, we have seen what can be generously described as a breakdown in relations between the left and right. The idea of how the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine should be handled, lockdown versus personal rights and freedoms, election security, and all manner of other conflicts. And what's interesting about these is they're all based on a divergence in opinions about what is true and what is false. My question to you today is, what do you see as the cause of these? The my fiction is your fact conflicts, and how can I, as a young Australian, avoid falling victim to them?
Yeah, thanks for the question, because it's a really important one. It goes to the fabric of the democracy. And what a democracy is based on? Free press, a media which fearlessly reports fact and quarantines fact from its own editorial opinion, hence my critique of Murdoch. And if we think this is just a problem at the margins, what we've seen in America through Murdoch's Fox News over 30 years is the slow and steady creation of this ecosystem where facts are invented to the point where we can then talk about alternative facts, which is where we got to during the most recent Trump presidency. Now, I come from an old-fashioned school which says that facts are something which are called empirical. That is, you establish through evidence that a fact exists. And other than that, it's an opinion. The method by which we then operate with our facts is through another convention called reason. We use reason to marshal facts to form a conclusion. This is such an essential, almost unspoken of part of our democratic life. But what I find increasingly through what Murdoch's Fox News has done in America is create this ecosystem of non-fact, of alternative facts, of opinion only, to the point that opinion and fact are conflated, which in fact is what Murdoch seeks to do more generally in his print media. And you also see this parallel phenomenon emerging now in a lot of branches of the social media. So what can we do about it, which is the heart of your question? Because left unaddressed, what it does is render our democracy somewhat ungovernable. That's the problem for us all. How can you fashion compromise with the institution up on the hill here if we're all operating off different, quote, fact bases? I mean, we can all have different opinions about the same body of facts, but if we're operating on different facts, then let me tell you, it becomes chaotically ungovernable. I think the beginning of the rollback against all this is simply to say no to the abuse of monopolies that actually have this as their standard craft. When we see it in social media, for example, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, to roll back and to complain to their own corporate regulators about the abuse of fact in their own Twitter and Facebook streams. But similarly, in the Australian media as well, whether it's through the toothless tiger, otherwise called the Australian Press Council, which usually take a year or two to resolve matters that I put to them, that this was not a fact, and here's the evidence, and then they'll think about it for 2 years, and then they may arrive at a conclusion. Maybe. But all I'd say is the key thing is to ensure that we have in our national media institutions a code of conduct, code of ethics, guidelines for our national profession of journalism, which is properly policed by the profession itself, which asserts constantly the centrality of fact and evidence as a basis for fact, which is why you print it and publish it in the first place. That's the confidence that the rest of us need to have in what the media has produced. But when you see this stuff, as I said, 7 times more debt produces that, 7 times less debt produces that, Liberal, Labor, conflation of fact and opinion, that's why people cease to believe. And if you cease to believe all that's then presented to you in the media, the mass media, the very basis of, let's call it, an information base to construct our future political arrangements becomes more fragile. That's why America is in trouble.
We're going to make this the last question because we're wildly over. Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
Thanks very much, Mr Rudd. You referred to China in response to Andrew Tillett's question. Looking at China and our relationship, what are 2 simple things that we could actually do to get that back on track?
Speak less and do more.
That's a perfect rounding up of the day, really. So please join me in thanking Kevin Rudd. Kevin? I've got to give the traditional handover. Now that you're actually in the country a bit.